Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today as we present to you the findings of our 2026 Hayes Asia Salary Guide. It's great to have all of you with us. So today we'll be focusing specifically on Japan's talent market and what the latest data is telling us about where hiring, retention, pay expectations, and workforce strategies are heading as we go into 2026. So my name is Grant Torrens, and I'm the Managing Director here at Hayes in Japan. And I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague, Guy Howard, who's our Head of Enterprise Solutions here. We're very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, and it's based on the insights from the 2026 Hayes Asia Salary Guide, with today's focus firmly on Japan. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll have a quick overview of who Hayes are, and then we'll explore how the salary trends, talent mobility and retention, contracting, as well as AI at work are all coming together to shape careers as well as workforce strategies in Japan. We're also going to highlight three main sector snapshots, which are going to be engineering, life sciences, and technology. And then we'll finish with some strategies for 2026 and beyond that you can take away, whether you're joining us from an employer perspective or from a job seeker perspective. And then at the end, of course, we'll open it up to any questions, which we'll be delighted to answer from any of you today. So we've designed this session to be fairly practical, whether you're an employer thinking about hiring and retention, or a professional who's planning their next career move. The goal here today is to help you understand what's changing, why it's changing and why it matters, and then finally, what you can do next.
So before we dive into Japan's specific findings, let me quickly set the context of who Hayes are and why we're in a good position to comment on those trends. Hayes is one of the leading specialist recruitment companies globally and is currently a market leader in both the UK and Asia Pacific. We have over 9,100 staff worldwide across 198 offices in 30 markets, and we recruit across 21 specialist industries globally. In Japan, Hayes is one of the largest foreign recruitment companies, with 3 offices, Tokyo as our head office, plus Yokohama and Osaka. We support clients across permanent hiring, contracting roles, temporary assignments, recruitment process outsourcing, MSP, and IT solutions across 13 different specialisms. So when we talk about mobility, skill shortages, salary pressure, or contracting adoption, we're seeing those dynamics across multiple workforce models, not just one segment of the market. Our work in Japan is supported by strong standards of governance and industry recognition. These certifications and awards reflect a commitment to quality, trust, and responsible recruitment practices, which becomes more important when the market is under pressure and decision-making is riskier for both employers and professionals.
Okay, so with that backdrop, let's now shift to the salary guide itself, because of course it's the foundation for the market insights that we're going to be sharing with you today. So this year's Asia Salary Guide is actually the 19th edition of it. It's the most comprehensive one that we have put together to date. We have gathered insights from over 13,000 respondents across the Asia markets, which I mentioned earlier. And that includes more than 3,500 respondents who came from Japan alone. The respondent mix was roughly 65% skilled professionals and then 35% organizations. So that mix really matters because that allows us to get a dual view of what talent wants, but also what employers are experiencing as well. And this guide isn't just about how people feel, it's a view into the forces that are shaping decision making. So areas like pay, risk tolerance, job switching behavior, and finally, how organizations are adapting.
So several headline trends stand out in Japan this year. More than half of professionals remain dissatisfied with pay, the highest percentage in Asia, which averages out at 44%. While not the only contributing factor, job mobility intentions are up, with 55% of professionals planning on a career change, also the highest in Asia, with an average of 50%. Concerns around job security persist. 28% of professionals feel insecure in their current jobs, again, the highest in Asia compared to 21% there. At the same time, skill gaps remain persistent, and organizations are increasingly exploring contracting as a way to address those shortages. Finally, AI adoption remains high, but training continues to lag behind. As you can see, compared with the rest of Asia, these gaps are wider in Japan, and they explain much of the trends we're seeing in the labor market today.
All right, so let's turn our attention now towards those salary trends, because of course, pay sits at the center of a lot of the movement that we are seeing in Japan right now. So when we compare salary changes across Asia, Japan does stand out. Salary increases are happening, but they are smaller than what we are seeing in the other Asia markets. As you can see, Japan has the highest proportion of professionals saying that they had no change or maybe like a moderate increase last year. And that in fact places Japan at the bottom of the regional comparison tables when it comes to average salary growth. And this is especially noticeable when you review the proportion of employees who said that they received a mid to high level increase, particularly in the ranges of 2.5% to 5%, 6 to 10%, or 10% and higher. But in contrast, Japan's distribution is much more heavily weighted towards the lower end, the no change end, or lower increases, especially up to 2.4%. So as a result, Japan's average salary increase of around 2.1%, that sits at the bottom of the Asia comparison tables. And this will help to explain why maybe frustration around pay increments, pay increases in Japan remains so high. Japan, it's not an outlier because we're saying that salary increases are not happening at all. They are, but rather it's showing that it's at the lower end. It's lower average salary increases when compared to Asia. So the increases are happening, but it's a much more smaller scale and a much more slower rate than what we're seeing across the other Asia markets.
So now let's look at salary satisfaction across Asia and why Japan stands out so clearly. Japan is the only market where dissatisfaction outweighs satisfaction, with more than half of professionals in Japan reporting dissatisfaction. So why is this happening even though salaries are increasing? Well, the key factor is the gap between salary growth and inflation. In 2025, Japan's average salary increase was around 2.3%, while consumer price inflation rose to approximately 3.1%, meaning purchasing power still declines. So this is not a story of no salary increases. It's a story of salary increases that don't translate into real felt improvements for professionals. In 2025, 58% of professionals expected to receive a pay rise. And in reality, 61% of those did receive one. So at a headline level, salary increases largely landed in line with expectations. However, when we look at the actual distribution, The largest group sits in the low increase range. 33% saw no change at all, and 27% received an increase of up to 2.4%. These two groups together form the core of the distribution in Japan. So while pay rises are happening, they're concentrated at the lower end, with relatively few professionals seeing larger increases of 5% or more, and only a very small proportion achieving over 10%. For many professionals, salary increases are not large enough to feel progress. This reinforces the thing we're seeing. Progress exists, but it often doesn't feel meaningful.
So now the question becomes, why is salary growth so constrained in Japan? And the first answer is there are different investment priorities here. Japan firms tend to prioritize capital investments, retain earnings, and business stability over aggressive spending on human capital and salaries. Secondly, Japan faces severe and persistent labor shortages. The Bank of Japan's own Tenkan employment conditions, DI reference, is currently at a -38. So that indicates a strong shortage on talent. And under these conditions, companies find themselves forced to allocate more budgets towards hiring employee acquisition costs, or perhaps contractor costs, and other vacancy coverage costs like training and development. And this can often impact the ability to then invest in broader base salary increases for existing employees. And then, of course, that then creates a cycle. The limited budgets are absorbed by immediate talent acquisition and retention costs, which then enforces the constraints on salaries, and then the cycle of attrition begins. So with that salary backdrop, let's now move and take a look at mobility and retention, because salary pressure and mobility intentions are obviously quite tightly linked in Japan right now. So if we take a look at the intentions to move, they are a little bit more tempered this year compared to 2025 across the rest of Asia. But there is one fact that does still remain this year, which is intentions to leave across all of the Asia markets are highest in Japan. And then when you overlay that with constrained salary growth, then obviously the logic becomes quite clear that professionals look externally now when internal progress feels more limited. So if we look here at how professionals in Japan achieve meaningful income growth, the single most powerful driver of a larger salary increase currently is that job change. They told us a change in employers accounts for 21% of all salary increases, alongside standard adjustments and then finally inflated related changes. But the real insight comes from job changes specifically. Amongst those professionals who did change jobs, 36% said that they did achieve a salary increase in double digits of 10% or more. If you then compare that to the people who stayed with their employer, many of them, of course, did see increases, but obviously the distribution skewers towards the lower ends. And a larger share did say that they still saw no salary increase at all.
Now, what happens after a successful job change? Not only does income rise, overall satisfaction rises too. Among professionals who changed jobs and achieved a salary increase, 69% reported being satisfied with their salary, and 62% reported being satisfied with their job. By comparison, for those receiving a raise within their current organization, salary satisfaction is lower and job satisfaction is lower. So mobility is reinforcing itself. Job changes drive better pay outcomes, and those outcomes reinforce confidence and satisfaction, which makes the market more dynamic. Of course, though, it's not only about salary. This slide shows the broader decision framework that professionals are using. When we unpack why people consider leaving, the top factors include lack of future career opportunities, salary and benefits, and lack of challenge or meaning in the role. And when we look at why people stay, salary still matters, but flexibility and work-life balance play major roles too. So the key message for employers, competitive pay is necessary, but that alone is no longer sufficient. Organizations need to make career growth opportunities visible and tangible, and they need to deliver flexibility in a way that feels real to their employees. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because this slide highlights a mismatch. Employers emphasize challenging projects, good atmosphere, and career development initiatives. Employees agree that those things do matter. But the difference is employees place especially high importance on compensation and flexibility, and often higher than most employers expect. So the practical takeaway: to compete against the market reality of double-digit increases through job changes, organizations need to provide two things. Firstly, compensation ranges that remain competitive. And secondly, career growth opportunities that are visible, credible, and communicated clearly.
I'll turn our attention to contracting, because as skill shortages persist, contracting becomes a really effective way and a more strategic workforce lever in Japan. Now, nearly 9 out of 10 organizations in Japan did say that they experienced skill shortages in the past year. And for many, these shortages are moderate to severe, and they do show no signs of easing. So that's driving a greater focus on contracting, with almost half of organizations saying that they are considering hiring contractors to address those skill gaps. And this slide here adds an important point. Contracting is no longer just a short-term fix. From the contractor's perspective, project choice is influenced by team and cultural fit, work-life balance, and flexibility, as well as organizational reputation and clear scope of work and meaningful work. So contracting has matured. It's increasingly a strategic workforce model, but success still depends on some core fundamentals: clarity, the onboarding experience, the scope of the role, and finally, the support provided. So for employers, this means that contractors will evaluate you just in the same way that your permanent talent evaluates you. It's an experience. So an employer's ability to carefully define the scope, support delivery in that role, and move quickly really becomes part of your brand.
So next, let's turn to AI, because as we all know, it's reshaping how professionals think about employability and also how organizations think about productivity and competitiveness. So firstly, from the employee perspective, AI usage is already very high. Around 74% of professionals use AI tools in their day-to-day work. And among those users, around 90% rely on tools such as ChatGPT, Copilot, or DeepSeek. However, formal support from employers is much lower. Only 32% of professionals we spoke to say their employer provides AI training, which highlights a clear usage ahead of enablement gap. If we then flip the perspective and ask why professionals don't use AI at work, the key barriers are a lack of understanding, support, or training. and for some, outright prohibition by the company. And it's clear that there's a growing fear of being left behind. 53% of professionals felt concerned that AI would pose a risk to their jobs. However, the silver lining is that people are motivated. 81% say they are willing to upskill or reskill to adapt. The employer perspective is also interesting. 73% of employers say they encourage AI use, and 57% say they provide training or support. But that doesn't fully match how employees experience it. Among companies that restrict AI use, a primary reason is security risk. So for employees, combining generative AI with role-specific expertise is one of the fastest ways to increase market value. For employers, the ideal approach is to implement security governance and frontline education together, because productivity from gains from AI can help you offset skills shortages.
Okay, so to make this practical, let's now ground some of these insights into three key sectors where we are seeing really clear patterns. And those sectors, as I mentioned earlier, are engineering, life sciences, and technology. And you'll see in the top right corner here, the QR code to download the salary guide. Of course, in that guide, you'll see much more detail around other sectors and other job functions. But for the purposes of today, we'll cover off these three sectors. Let's begin with engineering. So Japan's engineering sector has headed into 2026 with pretty uneven momentum across the different industries. So machinery and chemicals remain cautious. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment, factory automation, and automotive-related fields do continue to show more resilience. And that's supported by reshoring as well as supply chain restructuring. Automation and digitalization are accelerating as companies respond to chronic labor shortages, driving more demand for engineers who can operate across both hardware and software, as well as within digital systems. Talent shortages remain a key challenge here, particularly in semiconductors, factory automation, robotics, mechatronics, and field application technical sales roles. Bilingual professionals remain scarce, and they continue to command a strong market premium as we head into 2026. The sentiment is worth watching. Only 41% of engineers say that they are satisfied with their salary, and 62% of this job category did tell us that they are planning to change their job this year. And of course, 90% of all organizations within the engineering sector are experiencing skill shortages. So retention risk concentrates where skills are scarce and market premiums are visible, particularly bilingual and cross-disciplinary engineering talent.
Life sciences is moving into 2026 with more focused and selective hiring. Instead of broad expansion, companies are prioritizing roles supporting product launches, regulatory excellence, and data-driven decision-making. Medical devices and diagnostics remain active, with demand for engineers supporting connected devices, advanced imaging, robotics, and automation as clinical settings digitalize. In pharmaceutical and biotech, demand continues for regulatory affairs, clinical operations, medical affairs, and also CMC, especially professionals who can translate scientific and real-world data into strategy. Life sciences professionals actually appear happier than the Japan average. 56% are satisfied with take-home pay, but mobility does still matter, with just over half considering switching employers and 83% of organizations experiencing skill shortages. Even where satisfaction is higher, scarcity in cross-functional and bilingual talent keeps hiring selective and makes role clarity and employee value proposition, the delivery of that, very critical.
And finally, we'll move to technology. So Japan's technology sector heads into the year with steady hiring, but increasingly selective recruitment. Rather than hiring at scale, companies here are prioritizing talent that can drive legacy modernization, cloud migration, and of course, AI adoption. Chronic talent shortages continue to shape this market, particularly at the mid-career level. And we're seeing more potential-based hiring for younger talent and increased mobility amongst senior candidates. Investments in AI, cybersecurity, and cloud architecture is accelerating, sustaining premium demand for AI engineers, cloud talent, security specialists, and IT consultants. Of course, tech professionals sit between engineers and life sciences in the salary satisfaction rankings. Just over half told us that they are satisfied. 42% have no plans to change careers, but 83% of organizations have said that they are experiencing skill shortages. So selective hiring plus a high demand in AI and security means that salary frameworks here will get tested the hardest in mid-career roles, because that's where scarcity is going to meet business impact the most.
So with all of this in mind, let's translate the insights into practical takeaways. First for professionals and then for organizations. So for professionals, the message is clear. First, AI is already a mainstream tool, but formal training is lagging. So taking ownership of upskilling matters, whether through courses or hands-on experimentation. Second, mobility can be the quickest path to salary growth, but it needs holistic evaluation. Salary alone isn't the full story. You want to understand business stability, growth pathways, and whether the role aligns with what you value. Third, looking beyond pay, flexibility, stability, and benefits do matter. And the best decisions come from asking the right questions about the employer's value proposition. And finally, contracting is a credible career pathway. For many professionals, it offers rapid learning, flexibility, and access to cutting-edge projects. And with more organizations adopting contracting to meet skill needs, it's worth considering whether it fits your long-term career strategy.
And if we move across to organizations, the recommendations are equally as clear. First, close the AI training gap. Many employees are already using tools, so what they need now is guidance, governance, and a clear learning pathway so that productivity gains can be safe as well as scalable. Second, evaluate salaries and keep ranges competitive, especially for mid-level and high demand roles where the scarcity is going to be the most acute. Third, refine your employee value proposition, your EVP, and make career growth really visible and of course really credible, because in this market, salary alone isn't going to win you every hire. It also won't retain people when growth and flexibility begin to feel uncertain. Finally, adapt the agile workforce model. Temp and contracting can provide flexible access to specialized talent, but like permanent hiring, success will depend on those fundamentals that we discussed. the onboarding experience, the scope and clarity of the role, and the delivery support provided. So that sums up the first part of today's session, the findings of the Hays Salary Guide for 2026. We hope you found that insightful. We'll now move on to any questions from you, and we'll attempt to answer them as best as we possibly can. A reminder, you can ask questions through the Q&A function in this chat. You also have the chat button as well, which you can use if the Q&A function is not working for any reason. Now, to help kick things off, when we sent out the invite for today's webinar, we did ask everyone what was the information that you were most interested in hearing about, and we got a load of responses from everyone, so thank you very much. Based on all of that feedback, we then produced 3 kind of starter questions, which focus on the things that you asked us. So things like, why are salary increases remaining at around 2% in Japan? Does mid-career hiring, is mid-career hiring really that challenging? And what structurally differentiates Japan from the other Asian markets? So while Guy and I go through and answer those starter questions, please feel free to ask any other questions either in the Q&A function or the chat function. So the first question, why do salary increases in Japan remain around the 2% range? This is obviously timely because we are getting towards the end now of the Shunto spring negotiations. And once again, information is coming out that the agreed increase tends to be around that 5%. But of course, when you translate that nationally across Japan, it does tend to be lower, around that 2.1%. And there's several structural factors behind this. First, salary growth has not kept pace with inflation. And in fact, real wage growth last year was negative, about negative 1.5, 1.6. So consumer prices are rising higher. They're rising at about 3%, which is eroding the real wage growth. Secondly, productivity in Japan does remain weaker than other Asian countries. Japan is ranking 29th right now amongst all the other OECD countries in the labor productivity reports. And then thirdly, the persistent labor shortages in Japan, they do push up those hiring and outsourcing costs. So it makes it harder for companies, particularly SMEs, to then allocate budget towards a base salary increase for existing employees. And this is obviously reflected in the employer responses that we saw, where financial and budget constraints are mentioned as the top barrier to providing base salary increases.
Okay, so moving on to the second question, which we received from a number of people. Very simply, is the mid-career hiring market really that challenging? Well, the simple answer is yes, and particularly so in Japan. But don't just take our word for it. According to the Hays data, which comes from the client surveys, the most difficult roles to fill are mid-level positions, 54.6% of people said that, and manager and director roles, 47.8%. This is in fact consistent with the Bank of Japan's Tankan survey, which talked about labor shortages remaining structural and persistent, with economic conditions deeply in negative territory.
And finally, what structurally differentiates Japan from other Asian markets? And Japan does stand out in several ways. Salary increases, as we saw, they are narrower and skewed towards the lower range. So with a higher proportion of employees saying that they saw little or no change. We can also see that AI training provision is the lowest amongst all the markets that we surveyed. And that's despite Japan having quite high levels now of AI usage. And productivity rankings, as I mentioned earlier, do remain low in comparison to other international markets. So together, these factors do shape Japan's unique salary, mobility, and talent dynamics. So we are receiving some questions in the chat function, the Q&A function. I'll just have a quick moment to read it. So one question is around how common is it in Japan for companies to provide stock options as part of pay structures? And from our experience, stock options are not so common, but you would tend to find it more common at the more senior end of the hiring spectrum, particularly in international market, multinational corporations, of course, that are able to offer that. We see a lot of our candidates, senior level candidates, particularly management and C-suite, bringing that part of the salary to the table when it comes to negotiating new salaries. Obviously, a lot of those candidates explain to us that they are walking away from stock options that have not yet vested, and in return, they often want either equivalent stock options from the new company or a cash incentive, sort of a sign-on bonus or whatnot. In Japan, it typically tends to be the latter. We don't see so many companies offering stock options. Startups, in particular IT startups, will tend to offer equity deals for senior impactful employees. But otherwise, if an employee can show that they are giving up unvested stock options, the preferred route does tend to be a sign-on bonus or a cash payment.
Maybe I'll pick up another question that's come through a couple of times. Do companies still happily sponsor visas for candidates applying from abroad, despite the recent political changes? So I think from what we see, the simple answer is that yes, companies do still sponsor visas for candidates applying from abroad. However, as you point out there, the political climate has changed slightly, and the processes have become more complicated and more laborious for companies to gain visas for people outside of Japan. I think at the base level, companies will look at what the talent is, and if they're able to gain visas for people who have that suitable skill set, then they will definitely go after them. But we are seeing those application processes take longer. We're also seeing proposed changes in the news regarding language requirements, for example, for some of the, I think the engineering and humanities visas, which would apply if the role requires Japanese. So I think we're starting to see it becoming a little bit more complicated, a little bit more difficult. I think people who do have an existing visa in the Japanese market and who are in Japan will probably have a slight advantage in that sense. But at this point, companies are still willing to sponsor visas.
Yeah, job opportunities for foreigners in Japan obviously are going to be the strongest, where there's two conditions that need to be met. One will be that the work can be done in English, of course. And then the second one is that the skills that the foreign hires are providing are in short supply. So if we translate that into actual roles, that's going to be typically kind of IT roles, finance-based roles, engineering. There'll be certain roles within life sciences and manufacturing, especially within multinational corporations or Japanese firms that have global operations. Obviously, non-Japanese speakers, we do still find them roles in engineering, research and development, some back office roles as well, technical positions. But obviously, there are roles where a strong grasp of Japanese, or certainly a native level understanding of Japanese, is required. That's typically going to be more customer-facing roles. HR is obviously dominated by the requirement to have a strong level of Japanese language skills. Any kind of domestic sales roles will require strong Japanese. So for foreigners who want to come to Japan, there are opportunities. Of course, gaining a basic understanding of Japanese is going to be useful for you. I think the ability to I think people want to come to Japan. A lot of professionals do want to come and experience Japan. Attracting foreigners to Japan is not the hardest part. In my view, is getting foreigners to stay in Japan once they come here and they realize it is quite difficult if you don't speak the language. So I think for anyone listening who is outside of Japan and wants to come, doesn't speak Japanese, there are positions here that would be suitable for you, but my advice is definitely spend some time understanding the basics of Japanese, of course, because when you do move here, you'll find that life is a lot more pleasant and a lot more easier. Of course, as Guy alluded to earlier, there are changes to some of the visa categories to come to Japan. There is going to be stronger emphasis placed on having quite high level of Japanese knowledge. To be fair, it's kind of equivalent to N2 and N1 if you want to come over and take on some roles that have stipulated that they do need Japanese language. What that's going to do internally here for people that are already in Japan, it's going to place a greater sense of demand or a greater demand on existing employees or existing professionals in Japan who are bilingual. So that's just something for some employers to think about, that as these changes in the visa regulations come about, those N2, N1 or native level Japanese speakers who are also bilingual, they're going to find their skills in quite high demand. The salary expectations of these professionals is likely to raise even higher than what we've probably seen over the past few years.
There's also an interesting question here. Who are some of the Japanese FANG companies, if there's a similar set of companies at all? So obviously I don't profess to be an economist or a specialist in this, but I think from what we see, I think there's not as many companies in Japan who are scaling to such an enormous extent as those companies you mentioned are, but there's rather a broad-based growth across the industry. Obviously, areas such as semiconductors is a huge booming area. The government is also supporting a lot of investment into companies as they sort of scale that business. I think we're seeing growth in data center business as well. But there's a lot of startups as well that you will see if you just have to look at the Mothers Index to see, you know, some exciting companies coming through there. And there's a lot of ingenuity that's being developed and scaled quite rapidly. I think a lot of the innovation, though, does also come from the existing bigger Japanese companies, and maybe a good example of that might be Toyota, which has invested a lot in their future technology, and they've got initiatives and building a woven city, for example, which is becoming a big employer of both permanent and contract workers. So I think probably in Japan, it's fair to say it's a more broad-based growth across the economy, rather than having 4 or 5 companies which are just streets ahead of everyone else.
Okay, we have a question here around what is the required JLPT level for a manager or a director level for the IT sector? And I don't want to give a vague answer, but it really does depend on a whole range of different factors. The sector that you're in, whether the role is going to be based in Tokyo or whether it's going to be based in more remote areas of Japan. The sector, is it banking and financial services, or is it manufacturing? Is it semiconductors? All these variables really do play into it. Of course, we do see manager and director level hires or requirements come our way where a proficient language or language proficiency in Japanese is obviously preferred, but the hiring manager will say to us that it's something that we can overcome. As long as someone's got a desire to learn the basics of the language, then we can accept that. But of course, if you're in competition with someone who has a similar skill set to you and they are proficient in Japanese language, then obviously that would give the other person quite a significant boost in the race to secure that job. But as I mentioned, we have put senior level people into hires who have low levels of proficiency in Japanese. But of course, we definitely get hiring managers coming to us to say, for this role, whatever reason, it's based remotely, the team that they're responsible for is the level of English is not widespread. Or various other reasons, customer facing perhaps, they need to have stronger levels of proficiency in Japanese.
There's also a question here about one of the challenges we face is a limited pool of bilingual Japanese and English talent. Do you see similar challenges for the rest of employers in the market? And is there any best practice sharing to overcome this challenge? So this is a very common question, and no, you're not alone in this. There is a relatively limited pool of completely bilingual talent. And a lot of companies struggle with this point. I think the way that we see companies successfully overcoming this challenge is it comes down to what level of support you're willing to provide employees, but it's also about how we present the opportunity. So by that, I mean, a lot of Japanese English speakers will maybe not be as confident in describing themselves as bilingual, or will have some hesitation to show that level of confidence. When you consider that when you're advertising your roles or you're creating a job specification, you need to, I think, present it in a way where you're highlighting what needs to be done rather than a specific skill level that you need. So, for example, the ability to communicate with international colleagues, to join calls and meetings is obviously more important than a particular TOEIC score, for example. So I think a lot of the best practice that we see that companies are able to overcome this challenge is occasionally, sometimes even downplaying that requirement during the interview process to the point where you interview with a candidate and then you talk to them about their English level of confidence. Yeah, some of it is just really a matter of choosing what the preference is. In some extreme cases, you may even see that companies will just give up on having a need for example, an English speaker or a confident English speaker, because there's also a lot of tools now, obviously Copilot and the like, which can provide some level of translation support as well. So I think it's probably one where, to get the most out of this, you need to consider all your options. And if you are finding it particularly difficult to find that bilingual talent, then maybe that is one of the requirements that you can look to sort of downplay. If you're dealing with recruitment consultants, you can discuss that with them. Very often they'll be speaking directly with the candidates and they'll get a little bit more of a sense and be able to explain to candidates more about what the requirements are, maybe gaining a little bit more confidence to apply for certain roles. Hope that answers the question.
We also have a question here geared towards retention. So while compensation and career growth is essential for employee retention, they can strain company budgets, especially when the approval processes or the overall company performances are factors. So in situations where expense-related solutions are not feasible, what other key strategies or retention key points can we consider in order for employees not to leave their company? And of course, budgets, there might be base pay structures in place which can't be broken, particularly for large companies as well. There are other factors that you can consider to not only enable people to stay, but also open up the opportunities for people to come and join your company. Probably the number one that I would think of based on the studies that we have done would be just making sure that the career development opportunities within the organization are clearly communicated and communicated regularly. And not only clearly communicating those development opportunities, but then having meaningful one-to-one conversations, at least annually, but if not biannually, but at least annually with employees in your organization to ensure that, first of all, they feel that these opportunities are open to them, but they also really clearly understand where are the skill gaps that they currently have that maybe is stopping them from moving into those opportunities, and what are they going to be able to do over the next 12 months in order to close those skills. Then, of course, can your organization provide support in order to help them close those skills, whether that be time off to pursue study initiatives, or perhaps financial support to pursue study initiatives. Internal mobility options. I think sometimes companies maybe could do a better job in terms of being really visible on what the internal mobility opportunities are, whether that's cross-functional within the within the organization domestically, or perhaps if you do have overseas operations? What are the internal mobility opportunities or the secondment opportunities existing that would allow them to experience that maybe other companies aren't going to be able to help them to provide? Modern tech stacks, obviously there is a financial component to that as well, but I think if your company has not yet invested in modernizing the tech stack, but there are plans to do so in the near future, there'd be a communication plan involved in that, to making sure that people within the organization do understand that there is a plan in place to modernize the tech stack that's being used in the organization. And then, as Guy mentioned earlier as well, just investing some time really in dragging out those EVPs and polishing them up, making sure they're fit for purpose in today's AI world as well. Maybe the language within the EVPs that might have been written 5 years ago, 10 years ago, are geared towards elements that either don't really make sense anymore or are not important anymore. And they might exclude things that are important now, like the ones we've just mentioned, particularly around AI. And I think overall, just having that sense of purpose as well. Why do employees wake up and come to work every day? It's not usually because they want that salary. There needs to be a better purpose. And of course, every organization does set themselves up to satisfy a purpose. It's not just about profit and making revenue. That's obviously what keeps the lights on, but there are many ways how companies can generate revenue. Companies go down a specific pathway because once upon a time there was a founder who really saw a gap in the market and was driven by a purpose to pursue that. And it's about just recommunicating that sense of purpose to your employees and helping them understand what part they play in helping the organization achieve that purpose. There's also a question around AI, of course, and what does AI mean for the future of management jobs? I think AI has probably become less scary for a lot of people now. I think a lot of people have realized that actually AI is a tool to help us do our jobs more effectively, rather than this kind of mean robot that's going to come in and kick us all out of our jobs. So for managers, AI is less about becoming technical experts on the tools themselves. It's more about being able to kind of orchestrate those resources. So orchestrate the technology and the people, and then kind of envelope that in a proper sort of change management program. So organizations are looking for leaders who can understand what AI can achieve, what AI can do, and what AI can't do. They're looking for leaders that can then prioritize use cases. Obviously, there's an AI for everything these days, but leaders need to be able to cut through all that noise, cut through all the kind of snake oil salesmen, and go, right, where are we going to invest AI budget wisely? What's going to give us the best return on that investment? What's going to be the best use case for the tools that currently exist? And of course, leaders are there to manage the risks that are associated with using AI. So really, I think my biggest advice to managers is don't be scared of AI. I think you really need to embrace it. I believe managers who don't embrace AI probably will be sidelined. But those who do embrace it, those who can build literacy within AI tools, they are going to find themselves in demand for many, many years to come. I don't think there are any other questions. I'll just have a quick look at across both the chat mediums. I think we're all good. And my associate here is telling me, yes, there are no more questions. So I'll just hand over to Guy to take us through to the final points for today. But again, I just wanted to really appreciate everyone's attendance today. I hope you found it insightful. Of course, if you didn't have a chance to ask a question, you had technical problems or whatnot, you can always drop me a message on my email or through LinkedIn, of course, and I'll put you in touch with the relevant consultants that we will be more than happy to link up with you and have those discussions.
Okay, so before we close, the QR codes that you can see on the screen here will take you to Hays LinkedIn and also our website, where you can download the 2026 Asia Salary Guide, and as well as having a look, exploring additional publications and insights which Hays produces. If you'd like to stay connected, please follow Hayes. We share regular market updates, as well as hiring trends and practical advice. So as Grant just said, thank you once again for your time today. We hope you found it useful, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you all to solve your hiring and career challenges. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.